Welcome back to the channel. In this video I'll be replacing the power steering pump assembly, including the pulley and the reservoir tank for a 2004 Chevrolet SSR. So this procedure applies directly to the 2003 and 2004 with the 5.3 liter V8 LM4 engine. The same procedure is applicable to the 2005 and 6 with the LS2 6 liter, but I'm going to go through and give you an example of the noise it's making. I'll show you an example of a cold startup of the engine with the original pump in place so you can kind of hear the noise. I'll walk through the alignment using a laser to show you the alignment of the power steering pump pulley to the harmonic balancer, although they're not directly connected from pulley to pulley, but they should be in line with each other, including the alternator and the power steering pump. So I'll check that out, and then I'll go through removing all the stuff necessary. There's a simplified approach about getting this out by taking out the bracket that the alternator mounts to, including the power steering pump. So I'll show you that. So sit back and enjoy watching me replace my power steering pump on my 2004 Chevrolet SSR. Here's an example of the sound. It's not a large whirring noise, but it is a noticeable noise out of the pump when it's cold. So let's go to that audio sample now. So not exactly quiet, but it's not super noisy either, but it's certainly noticeable, especially at higher RPMs. So that's why it's being replaced today. I'm using my driver line from Gates to check out the alignment between the power steering pump pulley and the harmonic balancer. And it is just the slightest portion of a rib. You're supposed to be able to go half a rib, according to what I've seen in the documentation here. And we can see that that line down on the harmonic balancer is just to the left of the center rib. And the light from the laser is on the middle rib on the alternator. And the other aspect of this is the pulley was fully pressed on to the front of the shaft coming out of the power steering pump when I put this on back in 2011. So it looks like it's not a drive alignment issue. You want to make sure that you get your wrench at an angle such that when you remove the belt, it's actually going to go back further in a counterclockwise direction. So you don't want to start here. You actually want to start up at an angle like this. So we're going to make sure we get the right rotation here. And we're going to start at about a 45-degree angle. Then we're going to lift or rotate to the clockwise direction, which removes pressure from the belt, and then we're going to take our fingers and bring it out from the tensioner pulley, idler pulley over here by the alternator. And as you can see, when the tension released over here on the left, that the wrench is now further over, so that's why we want to start at the 45-degree angle. So now with the drive belt off the main pulleys here, we're going to get off the water pump and then undo it from its normal operating positions here, and that way the power steering pump and the alternator are going to be free for us to perform the task that we need to do today. You should note which direction the belt is positioned as far as front to back so that you can reinstall it in the same direction so it's rotating in the same direction once it's reinstalled. To further continue for the actual physical removal of the pump, we can see the pump pulley down the bottom here and the high pressure hose off the right corner. This is on the driver's side front corner of the engine. And we have the powertrain control module over here on the side, and the service manual says to actually disconnect the powertrain control module for the 2003 and 2004 SSR from the mounting bracket, move it off to the side, and somehow that will give you all the room that you need. Really not. The reservoir still being attached to the pump, and the pulley and everything, just if you leave all that stuff on, which will severely complicate the removal, you have to disconnect the high pressure hose, drain off the fluid on the bottom as well out of the reservoir before you disconnect the hose on the bottom. And once you've got that done, then you're ready to remove it, but there's still a physical limitation. So Mike at simple-engineering.com gave me a suggestion of removing the alternator from the top of this bracket, and then to loosen the 4 bolts that hold that bracket to the engine, and then the power steering pump will come out. And that actually worked out quite well, so I'm going to follow that approach in this video. When removing the negative battery cable, you have some standard cautions here to be aware of. Is make sure that your side windows are rolled down because the window indexing will not be working, and you will need to be in the cab at some point to do the bleeding procedure for the power steering system. So make sure you roll down the windows and make sure, of course, the vehicle is jacked up correctly. I have it on jack stands in the front. I have the front driver's side wheel off, and I placed that under the vehicle as a safety measure, and I still have the floor jack over on the passenger side, not holding the weight, but there in case the jack stand fails. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and go disconnect the negative battery cable in the rear. I've disconnected the negative battery cable, so I'm going to go ahead and now remove the wiring from the alternator, which involves a positive lead here with a 10mm nut. Let's see if we can bring up the camera a little bit more so you can see that a little bit better. The positive connectors here, control circuitry is over here. So let's get the rubber cap out of the way, loosen this. We can now safely do this with the negative battery cable removed. Put the nut back on the alternator so we don't lose it. And we can move this off to the side, get it out of the way. Now we can remove this connector. There is a little plastic clip at the base of it, if I remember right. Yes, on the back side here. So we lift up on this gray clip retainer and then walk this out. And set that off to the side. And now we've got the two mounting bolts, which have these adjustable sleeves here, which hold the tension, so they come in and torque on the alternator to hold it in place. So we may have to walk it a little bit here to loosen those up. So now I can actually get to these. Loosen them with this. These are both ready to come out, and so they're both the same size. We don't have to worry about which one came from which location. Now this is going to be a little tight because these sleeves have been pushed in, so walk it a little bit. You may need to get a screwdriver to help you elevate that. See if we can work this just a little bit more. Don't grab on the plastics here, just grab on the casing. No. It's walking just a little bit, but not enough to come out. So we're going to lift up gently on the casing, between the mounting bracket and the casing. And there goes that. And now we should be able to use that leverage to loosen up the other side a little bit. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It depends. There we go, it moved. So this should pull right out. Before I can remove the power steering pump, I need to remove the fluid and then disconnect the hoses. So I'm going to use my Midivac MV7400 fluid evacuator as the siphon device to pull the fluid out of the pump reservoir. Using the Midivac, I was able to evacuate the fluid from the pump reservoir in about 45 seconds. I sped this up a little bit so you can see the whole process. Not very entertaining, but you see the fluid coming out the tube down into that fluid evacuator. Of course, I'm going to recover that for recycling. I am going to go down on the bottom side, and again in that still picture you can see where the hose connects to the bottom of the, or middle point of the reservoir. I'm going to pull that off, and then I'm going to put this cap on here. This is the cap that came with the replacement pump for that particular hose nipple on the bottom or middle of the reservoir tank. So let's go ahead and get this pulled out. I have the bottom hose taken off the bottom of the fluid reservoir. And then I put a 3/8 inch drill bit into the hose to prevent any fluid coming out of the hose that I removed. So now we're going to loosen this, what appears to be a 16mm. Make sure we're not going to hit anything if we do break free. Here we go. And now there might be some fluid coming out from there as well. So I've got this bag, hopefully to try to capture any of that underneath. And then I've got the cap that came on the replacement tank, or pump, and I'm going to put that in there as well to contain any fluid. I'm going to try to bring this hose up as quickly as possible to let it dry. We're going to be replacing this hose as well. So let's see if we can move it by hand yet. Okay, so the threaded portion's free. And this has a nipple on it with an O-ring, if I remember correctly. So I'm going to try to walk that free. And there's the O-ring. So tip this up for the moment. And there is still some fluid in there, so because we never were able to evacuate the pump itself, so we're going to put this little cap on here. It's threaded with an O-ring, so that was nice. Okay, that's in place. So I should be able to, now I've freed the pump from the two hoses it's connected to. I just need to get the 4 bolts here, 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 and down there, get those loosened and hopefully get this removed. So I'm going to tackle the bottom one first. So it looks to be 15 millimeter for all of them. Nice long bolt. So let's remember the positions for these in case they are different lengths. So I have a 3/8 to 1/2 inch adapter and then a 1/2 inch socket, and that looks like that might work. Again, remembering the positions, they all look the same. I'll check them when they're all out, but it looks like they're the same. And the last one here. So this should be the only thing left holding that power steering pump in. So I'm going to have to move some stuff here to actually get this out. So the lighting's going to change a bit here. Get this hose out of the way. Make sure it's not dripping. Okay, because this does appear to be free. All right, so let's get the last bolt. Metal. All right, let's try to bring this out. Not snagging anything. And Simple Engineering's correct. This is much easier to take it out. The pulley, I'm actually going to get a new pulley in just a few moments. I have one, but it was dropped on the floor by someone to remain nameless during the many years that I've had it. And I want to make sure I get a nice, true, straight pulley to begin with. I'm not going to transfer over the pulley because I want to make sure that the pulley's not contributing to the noise factor that's in place here. But we will clean this up. So the next part we will go through is the pressing on of the new pulley on the new pump, and then we'll transfer that over to the bracket, get it back in. So here's the hose that I removed from the bottom of the pump, and I've got the 3/8 inch drill bit. Now that hose I'm not replacing. There is a hose that runs adjacent to that goes from the power steering rack up to that side that's on the low pressure side, and then the high pressure hose, of course, we have here. We need to get this out, and it looks like that is mounted through a bracket on just below the fuse box there. If we look in the back, let's move this up. Maybe you can see that. There's a bracket right back here for this high pressure hose, which then runs down to the steering rack. And so that's actually probably the next thing we'll work on while we're waiting for that pulley to show up, and try to get these replaced in preparation for the new pump to go in. Now, in my particular installation of the power steering pump, I wanted to replace the power steering pump hoses, but there's not a lot of space here, as you can see, so I removed the air box and the radiator cooling fan, and you can see the powertrain control module right above that particular bracket for the power steering pump hoses. So I decided I was going to remove that as well by loosening and removing the 2 bolts that hold it on, the 10mm bolts here. And that allowed me to flip up the powertrain control module out of the way, which gives you a lot more space to remove the hoses and tubings for the power steering pump on the front corner here. And you can see you can get to that mounting bracket bolt quite easily. Then under the engine fuse box, we have this mounting bracket. There's a 10mm bolt, and there's also a small tab underneath that wiring harness, so make sure you pull that out gently. And then the hoses connect to the power steering rack after converting to tubings. There's a tab actually connected to the high pressure side, and there's a single bolt, so pull the bolt out and then pull those tubings out. There are some seals there you need to potentially pull out of the power steering rack. Do that gently and replace them with new ones when you install the new hoses. And then on the front side, the oil cooler for the power steering pump system, you need to disconnect those. You can see them marked here about where they go. And then it's still tight spacing, even with all that removed. So I wanted to make sure I protected the radiator as much as possible by placing some cardboard on the back end of it, so I didn't rub the hoses or tubing from the power steering hoses and tubes up against the back end of it or press on it by any way, so be careful with that. Take some pictures of the locations and routing of the power steering system hoses and tubing to make sure you're aware of where they actually go, because there is a bit of a puzzle there with the wiring harnesses underneath the fuse box and on that corner of the engine. And then be careful extracting them and then reinstalling them. Again, make sure you put those new seals on at the power steering rack end, reattach the mounting bracket bolt underneath the engine fuse box, the one underneath the powertrain control module, then get the powertrain control module flipped back in place, put those 2 bolts in for the mounting bracket. Before reconnecting the low pressure return hoses on the oil cooler, make sure that you clear the oil cooler of any existing fluid and confirm that it's free and clear of any restrictions. And then reconnect the pressure return hoses, the low pressure side, up at the power steering oil cooler in the front. Then the only things you have left to connect are the return hose at the bottom of the reservoir for the power steering pump and the high pressure connection at the top end of the pump, but make sure you have a new O-ring on that if you're reusing the existing hoses. I'm going to use my pulley installer, and I'm not transferring the one over since I got a new pulley, just to make sure it's not contributing to any noise issues from the old one. The old one looked fine, but just in case. So we thread this down into the shaft of the pump. It's all the way down, and then we can, as far as we can get given this particular device, so we basically just push it on in this manner here. I already bolted the pump to the bracket that I took out. I'm not really putting any pressure on that bracket, I'm just using it to stabilize it. And we're going to push the pulley all the way to the point where the edge of this pulley on the outside is at the tip of the pump shaft, so that that's all the way installed on this particular style GM power steering pump. We should feel it bottom out because it basically won't be able to go anymore. Try not to put any pressure on the reservoir pump for the pump. Let's take a look, see where we are. How much further we have to go. It's still not quite out to the edge, so we have just a little bit more to go. And I think think we've hit bottom. Yep, feels like it. Alright, let's pull it off and check it. Yep, that's at the edge. So this pulley is now fully installed on this new pump, or remanufactured pump. And I don't see any wobble that way. So let's get this installed. I'm now going to reinstall the power steering pump, which is now attached to the bracket, and I'm going to install that back on the front corner of the engine and reinstall the 4 bolts that mounted that bracket to the engine. They appear to be the same length and diameter, but I put them back into their original position. Of course, I have the cooling fan and the airbox out, but that was for the power steering hoses and tubing to be replaced, but that's not necessary for the power steering pump. So tighten up those bolts and we'll move on. Making sure there's nothing in the seat here. And I've got the O-ring on with it being lightly lubricated with power steering fluid for instructions. And this being a new hose might take a little convincing to be routed correctly. Okay, that's tight. The power steering pump pulley center rib is aligned exactly with the harmonic balancer center rib. So we're good that way. I've reconnected the low pressure hose to the bottom of the reservoir. We have the high pressure hose connected here. We have the steering rack connectors done. We have the securing brackets in between done. And the hose connections up to the oil cooler for the power steering fluid is done. So now we can go ahead and start putting back this section here. Then we'll fill the system, do the 15-20 lock to lock, try to bleed out air, fill it as necessary, then start it up and try to do the same thing, and hopefully no noise. So let's get the rest of the engine compartment put back together. Please remember I removed the radiator cooling fan and the airbox to get the radiator cooling fan out because I wanted the extra space to remove the power steering hoses and tubing out of there without having extra tight spaces. I don't think I would have been able to accomplish it without removing them. But here's the reinstallation. I'm actually reinstalling my Simple Dash Engineering replacement radiator cooling fan. Of course, the bracket on top, make sure you get those rubber grommets in that bracket so that it sits down all the way. Reinstall all the bolts. Then the airbox sits on top of that. Get the appropriate bolts and nuts in place, and when you put the backside on, make sure you get the shelf on the backside of the airbox cover here so that the radiator hose sits on top of that so you don't have it hanging off. And I've seen the water pump pulley digging into that. So make sure you pay attention to that. Reconnect the mass airflow sensor and then the clamp on the throttle body and the decorative plastic. Now let's move on to the alternator installation. I'm now going to reinstall the alternator. It fit into the top bracket. I had already moved those 2 bushings out a little bit to remove the alternator, so it dropped into place. I'm going to hand thread these bolts in, then use my power tool to snug them up. Tighten them up so that the spacers push in again. And that should be solid now. It is. Get the control wire connector back in and snapped in. There it is. We still have the negative battery cable disconnected, so I can safely do this. Covers back on, the guide plastic clip is back on the valve cover stud extension there. Alright, so we have this back in place, that pulley's in place. All the front pieces are in place. We have the fan connected. It's going through the proper hole here. This is all in place. I guess we're ready for the drive belt. And then we can start filling our pump reservoir. So we're missing this, so let's get this installed. Idler pulley is in place. So let's get this belt back in. Now we don't have to worry about as much as where we position this because there'll be less travel of it once we release it. So we just need to pull down the belt. Make sure we're going in the correct direction. Yes, we are. Get it under the idler here. Let go. And then check to make sure that we got everything on each of the pulleys on the right grooves. Yes. 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 All right, drive belt's back in place. In summary, we have the cooling system fan back in place, shrouds for the air intake back in place. We have the alternator reconnected. We have the drive belt back in place. We have the fluid system for the power steering pump back in place. On the power steering rack, the guide clips, the one in the middle here, the one under the ECM, and we have the ECM back in place as far away as possible as we can from that particular hose. And we have the power steering fluid cooler hoses back in place. We have the bottom of the reservoir low pressure back in place. And so I think we can go ahead and reconnect to the negative battery cable and then begin filling the system here. Now we're going to slowly start to refill the power steering fluid reservoir, and then I'm not going to fill it up fully because I'm going to do side to side wheel rotations to try to burp the air out of it. And then once we get a fairly steady fluid level, then we'll go ahead and start it up and do the same thing, try to burp out any remaining air. But right now we're just going to try to get as much air out as we can by filling in with some fluid initially and check the level as we go along. Seems to have flowed down a bit out the tubings, I can imagine, at least on the lower side. Okay, we're beginning to show on there. We're just going to add a little more. We're on the add line. We're a little above full, so I'm going to try moving the steering wheel. The service manual bleed procedure states to rotate the steering wheel from all the way left position to the all the way right position and do that 15 times without the engine running. I have the cap on top of the reservoir, but it's not fully installed. I can hear the air burping out. Do this until the fluid level doesn't change. Yeah, it went down further, so it's below the add line, so let's add it. Just a hair below full, so let me top it off just a hair more. And then we'll do another 10 left to right steering wheel rotations. See where we are now. And I'm not sealing this off in between. I want the air to be able to escape. Right at full. So I'll even leave it off this time. I'm performing another 10 left to right full rotations of the steering wheel to let more air come out of the system, and then I'll check the fluid level again. Pretty much still full where we were. I'm going to put that back in place. Now check the bottom of the reservoir, the oil cooler connections, and at the power steering rack, just to make sure it's not oozing fluid. Well, it looks like we're at the point where we should be able to start it. Making sure we're all clear, belts on, attention, and let me check this connection here, make sure it doesn't. Looks dry at the moment. So, let's see what it sounds like. And then, we're still not done bleeding. We need to do power down with a high pressure part of the pump running and make sure we do left to right full rotations 10 to 15 times. So it may start up with some noise, but hopefully we can get it quieted down if it does. As you may notice, the first few seconds there was a little bit of whine, which I expected since the high pressure hose hadn't been fully filled with fluid. And then I continued the bleed procedure of left to right rotations, and then I came out and checked the fluid level while it was running, and then I checked the various hose connections and at the power steering rack and all along the hoses, and everything looked clean and dry, and the noise was reduced by about 95% compared to the original pump that I removed. I checked all the hose locations, the new hose, even at its crimp points and everything. So far it looks nice and dry. The pump seems reasonably quiet. The other one would whine at cold start pretty noticeably, and then at about 2500 to 3K you'd hear into the passenger compartment, and I hear the engine noises, especially now that I have the wheel well open here, but everything seems good so far. I don't see any problems. Potentially call this a successful power steering pump replacement. Did get a little bit further into it than I had anticipated as far as what I was removing. Because of the hose replacements, I didn't need to do it, but I wanted to make sure I did that to make sure that whatever was causing the noise wasn't a restriction in the pipe or the hoses, or down in the power steering pump rack, the nozzle, it didn't have some junk in it or whatever. But these are new hoses, new or remanufactured pump, different company doing it this time. But again, I had the cooling fan out for just the power steering pump. I wouldn't have need to remove that, but with the hoses it was necessary. So if you're doing a power steering pump replacement, I would suggest following the directions from Mike at Simple Engineering like I did, and just take out the alternator by safely disconnecting the battery ground, disconnecting all the connectors here, bolts, bring it out, and then there's 4 bolts that hold on that mounting bracket for the alternator and the power steering pump, and that comes out nicely. But you do need to take the air intake off here to get it out, and that made it a lot easier because the first iteration had me taking the ECM out, and that was quite painful. Although once all this was out of there, the 2 bolts that were holding it over on the side here actually allowed me to tip it out of the way to get better access. So there's a lot you probably saw in this that wasn't totally necessary, but again, because of the hose replacement, it ended up being beneficial to do so. So with that, I'm going to take and get this on the road again, put the wheel back on, torque it down, and take it on a test drive and see what we can say afterwards. I took the vehicle on a test drive and went on my normal test loop around my home. It's about a 15-mile test route, and I was very happy to not hear anything from the pump. Like I said, the pump's maybe 5% noisy compared to the other ones, so 95% reduction, which is great. And I'll be checking that over the next several weeks as I drive the vehicle. Next several days, I'll be checking for any leaks and reductions in the fluid level, so I need to check that periodically over the next several days. Assuming that I don't see any leaks or reduction in fluid level, then I'll just return to the normal maintenance checks of the fluid level for the power steering system. If you found some information in this video helpful to you, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, it's free. Make sure you hit that bell notification to be notified when I upload new videos to the channel. It does take a lot of time and effort to produce these videos, so if you'd like to become a financial supporter of Retro Car Guy 530 LLC, make sure you check out the links down in the description section. There's one for Patreon, where you can become a monthly supporter at the $1, $2, or $5 level. Or if you'd like to make a one-time contribution to Retro Car Guy 530 LLC, check out the PayPal link down in the description section. Thanks for coming and check out the Chevy SSR repair video. Check out the Chevy SSR playlist for other videos on the Chevy SSR, and check out my current project vehicle, my Chevy Caprice PPV, the ex-police vehicle. So thanks for watching. See you in the next one.